Du Fu, a woman of quality, matchless in breeding and beauty. A fine lady has taken refuge in this forsaken valley. She is of good family, she says, but her fortune has withered away. Now she lives as the grass and trees. When the heartlands fell to the rebels, her brothers were put to death. Birth and position counted for nothing. She was not even allowed to bring home their bones for burial. The world turns quickly against those who have had their day. Fortune is a lamp flame flickering in the wind. Her husband is a fickle fellow who has a lovely new wife. Even the veg tree is more constant, folding its leaves each dusk, and mandarin ducks always sleep beside their mates. But he has eyes only for his new woman's smile, and his ears are deaf to his first wife's weeping. High in the mountains, spring water is clear as truth, but it reaches the lowlands muddied with rumour. Her serving maid returns from selling her pearls. She drags a creeper over to cover holes in the roof. The flowers the lady picks are not for her hair, and the handfuls of cypress are a bitter stay against hunger. Her pretty blue sleeves are too thin for the cold. As evening falls, she leans on the tall bamboo. So, the main topic of this poem is pretty transparent, and it's the downfall and the misery of a woman, of a rich and cultured woman who has known better times. So instead of the typical story of from rags to riches, this is the inverse. This is the story of a woman that has gone from riches to rags. It has an intensely sad, melancholy, even we would say melodramatic quality to it. As you might remember, one of the great topics of classical Greek tragedy is the fall of the powerful. Yeah, but generally in Greek tragedy, this fall is up to a point self-motivated by hubris, by doing something wicked. Here we do not get that impression. This woman who was from a good background and who lived probably a gilded life and who now finds herself in hunger and misery and poverty and loneliness doesn't seem to be guilty of her condition by anything she did, or she just appears as a victim of a terrible time of war, of chaos, and of misery. And that doubly calls to our attention the sadness of her plight and how much we should pity her because she's just an innocent victim. She hasn't produced her situation in any way. So we could say that the poem has, let's say, three main sections. The first section, which is about the first 6 lines in this edition, approximate, or even less. No, probably the first 4 lines. This is a background. This is like the setting for the poem. It very briefly introduces us to this woman through a series of ironical paradoxes or antithetical statements. So she's a beautiful and well-bred woman, but she's in this forsaken valley. She's from a good family, but now she's poor and lives as the grass and the trees. So we get in these first 4 lines the poem in a nutshell. The main body of the poem explains how her predicament came about, basically through the abandonment she has experienced from her blood relatives and from her relatives by marriage. As for her blood relatives, we are told that the heartland was invaded by barbarians. So this very probably refers, if this poem is meant to be a reflection on contemporary affairs, to the An Lushan rebellion. So when that happened, her relatives were probably all massacred. Specifically, the poem mentions how her brothers were killed, and she wasn't even able to bury their bones, so she carries that suffering with her. And later on, we get to hear that her husband, the one who should have protected her once her relatives by blood have disappeared and are unable to protect her, is a fickle person. He has ignored her, abandoned her, and he's interested in his new young wife. So she's completely alone in the world, and she's part of those people who always inspire our pity, like abandoned women, children, orphans, cripples, old people, with the intensifier that as she has known a life of prosperity and wealth in the past, we can feel her pain at the change as doubly intense. If she had always lived in poverty, we would understand that she would be at least partially used to it. Now, the last section of the poem, the last 6 verses or so, take us back again to the present and to the terrible plight of the woman, which is described in a little bit of detail through a series of pathetic anecdotes. So her maid goes to sell her pearls. She has to try to live in some sort of dilapidated hut using plants to cover herself in her building. She makes a living out of flowers. She eats wildflowers. She doesn't have money for buying grain. And the poem concludes with a very, very sad, pathetic image. Her clothes, her pretty blue sleeves, they're pretty, but they're ineffective, too thin for the cold. So she's shivering. Evening falls. She leans on the tall bamboo. So it's an image of sadness and desolation, of cold and hunger, and of apprehension at what the cold night and the future is going to bring for this lady. So I think the poem is very effective. It reflects very well Du Fool's reputation for a social conscience, as opposed to the flamboyant beauty and extravagance of the wild, drunkard, poetic genius that appears in Levi's poems, and sometimes with a supernatural accompaniment of gods or Taoist creatures. Here we get social criticism embedded in a very classicist form. So Du Fu is a very polished writer, a very classicist writer in themes, in form, but he has this social conscience that appears in many of his poems as it appears here. So what things could we mention as especially interesting in the translation? As I mentioned before, there is a series of parallelistic contrasts which create an irony between the essence of the woman. This woman, as we said, is beautiful, is well nurtured, she comes from a good background, but all those things pale in confrontation with the harsh realities of her time. Some beautiful images, which perhaps could be connected with Buddhist karma. So this woman is not guilty of anything that she has done, but karma might be catching up with her. We never know that. And the central image of the poem, the world turns quickly against those who have had their day. Fortune is a lamp flame flickering in the wind. So it's a beautiful image, you know. The flame of the lamp, if it's a little bit windy, shakes this way and there, and it connects with a very European and very medieval topic. Yeah, Rota Fortunae, the wheel of fortune, and how fortune is unstable and no one can trust her, and the rich come down and those who are down go up. A very strong image in the poem also is the caricaturization, in fact, the animalization of the woman's husband. So the woman's husband is represented through the images of the poem as less than human. He's a vile creature. He has abandoned his wife for a new one, and this is vile beyond words. This is vile beyond humanity. So even animals and plants, the poem says, show a greater degree of attachment and loyalty to their loved ones. So the vetch tree is more constant. It at least folds its leaves every night, and mandarin ducks are famous for being loyal to their mates and always living together with them. This is not the case with humans, at least not with this fickle fellow who is the husband of this woman. Yeah? And it is implied, I imagine, in the lines that say, high in the mountains, spring water is clear as truth, but it reaches the lowlands muddied with rumor. We might imagine here, I'm not sure how to interpret these lines, but I take them to mean that the husband has all too willingly given thought to slander. As I said, the last part of the poem concludes with a very pathetic description of the protagonist in very dark circumstances. And This reminds me, some medieval paintings or Renaissance paintings of the Nativity. So you have the Virgin Mary as a beautiful lady, the baby, her husband, all living in a little miserable hut, and there is an intense contrast between the beauty of the lady and the misery of her surroundings. And this is created by the ending of the poem. A great poem. We shall continue with another of Du Fu's poems next day.